everyone. We are the Wildcard Group. I am Sarah, this is Lynn, this is Jody, and that's Vince. The Wildcard Group, we are so named because we were given less structure for journals. We had to search and find our own journals for this project. As a result, we have a variety of journals and a variety of articles from those journals. So I'll start with mine and then let each person kind of introduce the journals that they found. I got lucky in my search because I was able to pull most of my articles from a single journal. So I was using the Environmental Science and Policy Journal for my articles. My articles tended to be on two subjects, and so I'll run through the titles of these articles and we'll see what those two subjects are from those titles. So I have Collins, Blackmore, Morris, and Watson, a systemic approach to managing multiple perspectives and stakeholding in water catchments, some findings from 3 UK case studies. Higgins and Walker, Ethos, Logos, Pathos, Strategies of Persuasion in Social Environmental Reports. Homewood, Policy, Environment, and Development in African Rangelands. Lovebrand, Pure Science or Policy Involvement, Ambiguous Boundary Work for Swedish Carbon Cycle Science. Rantala and Primer, Value Positions based on Forest Policy Stakeholders' Rhetoric in Finland. Shepard, just Shepard, Landscape Visualization and Climate Change, the Potential for Influencing Perceptions and Behavior. Smith, Wall, and Blackstock, the Role of Map-Based Environmental Information in Supporting Integration between River Basin Planning and Spatial Planning. So as you can tell from those titles, a lot of these articles are on the wicked problems issues between science and policymakers. So boundary work between scientists and policymakers, as well as strategies of persuasion that are used by both groups, are topics that I found in this journal, including discussions of visual rhetoric, in particular the use of maps.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, like Sarah mentioned, we were much less structured, and so instead of focusing on just one article, or one journal, excuse me, I decided that I would branch out and use the power of the search engine, and I quickly left Google Scholar to go to some other databases that I found a little richer. And as I migrated to those databases, I came across articles with similar themes on incommensurability, as well as rhetorical analysis of various things that were happening not only in science, but in science and industry, science and technology, science and agriculture. The two articles that I'll showcase for you this evening, one is entitled Interdisciplinarity and Postmodernity in the Environmental Sciences. This came from a Journal of History and Technology, and this particular article discussed, again, the interdisciplinarity and postmodernist approach to environmental science. The author argues that incommensurability became a precondition for postmodern science, not because of our ability to endure it, but because of our ability to ignore it, which I thought was an interesting concept. The second article was one that I couldn't pass over. This was an article by Carl Herndl et al., a lot of famous people here at Iowa State and elsewhere. It was entitled Talking Sustainability, Identification, and Division in an Iowa Community, and this came from the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture. I found this article interesting because right away at the very beginning of the article, the premise was they were going to look at the rhetorical use of language, so it was a winner right away. The authors explored whether or not there are bridge words which exist that could create some sort of common ground between supporters and detractors of sustainable agriculture. The interesting thing about this journal itself is that it uses an interdisciplinary approach, and I thought that for further study in rhetoric of science, this might be a good source to go to. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jody.
All right. Hey guys, I am going to very briefly introduce you to 4 separate articles that I found in 4 separate journals. That's the perks of being the wildcard group. I got 4 different journals. The first journal is Biocontrol. You can guess what that is about. It's the official journal of the International Organization for Biological Control. And the journal publishes interdisciplinary papers with a global perspective on the use of biological control in integrated pest management systems and related developments in molecular biology. And this particular article is by Keith Warner, and in his article, Warner explains the possible reasons for pathophobia among non-scientists and presents a plan for how to mitigate this fear through the building of trust and engagement between scientists and the lay public. So basically, a lot of people are afraid of biocontrol things such as pesticides and that, and a lot of times there's not a scientific reason for that, but it's the fear is built around the rhetoric being used. And so this article explains how to mitigate that fear with language. Another journal I looked at was Human Communication Research, and it's one of the official journals of the International Communication Association, and it concentrates on presenting the best empirical work in the area of human communication. The article I pulled from here was from Jacob Jensen. In this article, Jensen addresses the question of, does hedging in scientific news reports have any effect on readers' perceptions of scientists and journalists' credibility? And he looked at this by looking at past studies on the subject and conducting a multiple message study of his own, which fits right in with this journal that conducts empirical studies. With this article, Jensen writes a detailed account of the study he conducted as well as an analysis of his results. In the third journal is Climatic Change. The purpose of this journal is to provide a means of exchange between those working on problems related to climatic variations but in different disciplines. So basically, interdisciplinary researchers are all invited to submit articles to this journal. So it's not just about everyone working in the same discipline, and that means you can have authors that have an opportunity to communicate the essence of their studies to people in other climate-related disciplines and to interested lay people. The article I pulled from here was from Bridget Nerlich, and her paper discusses how the lexical compound low carbon and the metaphor low carbon future in particular came to prominence in policy discourses, especially in the UK, and how they were used to frame expectations of a prosperous low carbon future while sidelining deeper social and cultural reflection on climate change mitigation. And the fourth and final journal I have is from the Science, Technology, and Human Values. And this is a peer-reviewed bi-monthly international interdisciplinary journal containing research, analyses, and commentary on the development of dynamics of science and technology. And this article I found was from Sonia Schmid. In this article, she examines an exemplary part of the Soviet media discussion following the Chernobyl disaster. She traces transformations in the discourse affecting the concepts of risk and uncertainty and indicates their relevance for the reconfiguration of the relationships between the state, the scientific experts, and the public. So the discourse that happened there is all analyzed. And so those were my 4 very brief introductions to the 4 different journals and articles.
And so Jody already introduced the Journal of Science, Technology, and Human Values, and that's largely where I drew my articles from. And so needless to say, when you have a journal that focuses on culture, politics, and society, you're going to have rhetoric at work in some way, even if it's talked about a little bit differently. In this journal, it's approached through a sociological point of view for the most part. And as a result, it deals a lot with audiences, perceptions of technology, perceptions of science, scientific research. And so we have a lot of audience interpretations and activity. And for this reason, we also I found at least, a lot of emphasis on the social construction of technology, which could be shorthand SCOT. And such studies are integral to the articles that I found, with a lot of allusions to Geiger, Pinch, Latour, and Woolgar, laboratory studies, developments of scientific knowledge, and the rest. And so if you're familiar with that and what Latour has contributed to that field, you know that there's a lot of actor network theory at work in what he talks about. And so in this object of human uses of technology and interpretations of scientific facts, you see a lot of rhetoric being used synonymously with social construction. And for the most part, that's what I found. In one article, we saw an emphasis on the public understanding of science and looked particularly at sort of a constitutive rhetoric created through how audiences interpreted publications of any sort, whether they felt to make their own understandings of it, to sort of find their own way of interpreting it for their own purposes within their own communities. Another one looked more so at rhetoric as a power structure around, in particular, counter-terrorism feats in brain imaging technologies, such as if you look at somebody's brain, you can sort of tell their motivations, which is very much an interesting way of talking about a rhetoric. Another perspective concentrated on science communities itself, social construction of important terms. In this case study, it was about pharmacogenomics versus the less persuasive term pharmacogenetics, which is interesting because they used the former term in order to gain more funding and research agenda. And lastly, I looked at an article, well not lastly, one more, a more social constructive perspective on what looked at the future-oriented rhetoric about advancement in nanotechnology and how we've created a certain rhetoric at that very idea. And then another more philosophical look looked at the notion of seeing and knowing, so we're kind of tapping into an epistemic rhetoric, creating knowledge together, particularly within an observational, empirical setting. And this article looks particular at Latour's laboratory life sort of approach to things. So in conclusion, I had to find a balance between sociology and philosophy and rhetoric, and try to make a judgment on where I could find rhetoric at work in these articles, which, as I said, was mostly from a sociological perspective.